We talk more to ourselves than anyone else in our life. And it just so happens that the way that we talk to ourselves can dramatically impact our performance. We fall into downward spirals, or we speak seemingly impossible things into existence. We've seen how Kobe frames everything like a challenge and how Tiger reinforced his confidence through affirmations. This begs the question, is there a science to the conversations that we have with ourselves? I recently read this book right here called Chatter by Ethan Kross to better understand how to navigate the conversations that we have with ourselves. I highly recommend the book, and I've linked it in the show notes and in the description of the podcast. In this episode, I'm just going to simply pull out some of the highlights from the book and try my best to make them relevant to sports performance. I still encourage you to read the whole book because there's so much information in this and plenty of things that I couldn't cover in this episode. So if you really are interested in this topic and want to learn more, I think you should use this as the number one resource. Also, to be clear, I'm not a doctor or a professional related to this topic. These are just my takeaways based on the science that I found here. I also will say that this is a little different from the norm of how I approach these podcasts. I thought it would be more effective to do a book review than to bring in an individual guest. This book is a culmination of a bunch of different research rather than singular research in a specific domain. I'm hoping that I can cover this in an effective way so that we can get the whole story rather than just listen to one researcher talk about one specific thing. This is fundamentally different, in my opinion, than the alter ego effect. My interview with Todd Herman was very specifically focused on his experience and in the domain of alter egos. This is a little bit broader. There's many different tools that the author highlights. And in order for me to be able to do a more complete job, I thought it would be interesting to try a literary review like this. So to start things off, let's quickly define what chatter is. So Ethan describes chatter as, chatter consists of cyclical negative thoughts and emotions that turn our singular capacity for introspection into a curse rather than a blessing. It puts our performance, decision-making, relationships, happiness, and health in jeopardy. We think about that screw up at work or a misunderstanding with a loved one and end up flooded by how bad we feel. Then we think about it again and again. We introspect hoping to tap into our inner coach, but we find our inner critic instead. I think that's pretty elegantly put. I think we could also dumb it down a little bit to say that chatter is negative spiraling self-talk or negative spiraling ideas that keep coming back and hurt our performance over time. Chatter is also really common with athletes of every level. When things aren't going well, you start to get into slumps, or when things are going well and you have positive chatter or positive talk and mental imagery, things can start to pick up and you build momentum over time. So most of the athletes that we've studied, we've looked at Tiger, we've looked at Kobe, and so far I've done a bunch of research on Federer so far. They have their own strategies that maybe they've innately come to or coaches have helped them come to combat this chatter. And this book is going to be largely focused on what strategies we can use to either break the negative thought patterns or to create appropriate thought patterns for us to perform at our best. Let's also start with a little bit of background. So why do we even have self-talk? Why do we have conversations with ourselves? That's something that, at least for me, was really interesting. And to figure out the framework of why these are useful to us rather than just harmful to us on the basketball court or on the golf course or any of these things. In the most basic sense, introspection simply means actively paying attention to one's own thoughts and feelings. The ability to do this is what allows us to imagine, remember, reflect, and then use these reveries to problem solve, innovate, and create. Many scientists, including the author, see this as one of the central evolutionary advances that distinguishes human beings from other species. So introspection, or us being able to talk to ourselves or evaluate our performance or look retroactively, it means, or retrospectively, it's one of the things that helps us be creative. It's one of the things that helps us problem solve. So this is a very important evolutionary mechanism. But sometimes evolutionary mechanisms that help us get to where we are now, they don't necessarily help us in the present, and they can sometimes get in our own way. So again, there's this clear evolutionary benefit to having this system in our brains, but it can go a little bit awry. There's also this thought, and there's a lot of conversations, a lot of talk of living in the present. I think that the athletes we've studied, and Federer, when we do study him in particular, do an unbelievable job of staying in the present. But From what I understand from looking at this research, the present isn't necessarily our natural state. It's important for us to be able to look in the past or look to the future for us to be able to plan, but also to learn from our mistakes. So why do we even retrospect, or why do we look internally in the first place like this? In recent years, cutting-edge methods that examine how the brain processes information and allows us to monitor behavior in real time have unlocked the hidden mechanics of the human mind. In doing so, they've uncovered something remarkable about our species. We spend 1/3 to 1/2 of our waking life not living in the present. As naturally as we breathe, we decouple from the here and now, our brains transporting us to past events, imagined scenarios, and other internal musings. This tendency is so fundamental that it has a name, our default state. So again, meditation actually leads us to have less activity in this default state, which is part of our default mode network. Kind of ancillary information, but it is all related. So meditation is described as living completely in the present. Mindfulness is focusing on living in the present. This other part of our brain, which has evolved, is important, but it doesn't always optimize our performance. Our performance is usually best when we're able to turn off this default state or silence the default mode network. Again, these states are neither good or bad. They just serve function in our daily lives in different ways. So it was noted before, but memory is also an important part of our introspection. Us looking internally allows us to evaluate things we've done in the past. While memory lane can lead us down the chatter lane, there's nothing inherently harmful about returning to the past or imagining the future. The ability to engage in mental time travel is an exceedingly valuable feature of the human mind. It allows us to make sense of our experiences in ways that other animals can't, not to mention make plans and prepare for contingencies in the future. Just as we talk with friends about things we've done and things that we'd like to do, we talk to ourselves about these same things. Now, think about how useful memory has been relating to the athletes we've studied so far. So we talk about Kobe and Tiger being able to time travel. So they can time travel back in time to when they were kids to relieve pressure. They can travel in the future to these high impact moments so that they can really get a feeling and aspire to those things that they're trying to achieve. This, without a doubt, is a really powerful force that they use, but they can couple that with being able to silence these things when they're living in the moment or when they're competing. We also want to touch on the inner voice. So it's not just our introspection. We talk to ourselves. We have, some people describe it as the devil on one shoulder, the angel on one shoulder. We have conversations with ourselves. The majority of people do this. And it's through words, through language for the most part. Our verbal stream of thought is so industrious that according to one study, we internally talk to ourselves at a rate equivalent to speaking 4,000 words per minute out loud. To put this in perspective, considering that contemporary American presidents' State of the Union speeches normally run around 6,000 words and last over an hour, our brains pack nearly the same verbiage into a mere 60 seconds. This means that if we're awake for 16 hours on any given day, as most of us are, and our inner voice is active about half the time, we can theoretically be treated to about 320 State of the Union addresses each day. The voice in your head is a very fast talker. So we have conversations with ourselves. These conversations happen very rapidly. And if you don't understand how to manage these conversations with yourself, to have them effectively, to have them in positive ways that lead to your own benefit and your own performance, you can see how quickly things could run awry because there's so much information and so many conversations that you're feeding to yourself. Let's talk about some of the good things and the bad things that can happen associated with self-talk, but let's mainly focus right now first on the bad things that can happen with the chatter. Obviously, we're going to touch on the things that we can do to mitigate some of these bad things. So again, let's start with the bad. So using the mind to engage with our thoughts and feelings in the wrong ways can lead to professional athletes to lose the skills they've spent their careers perfecting. It can cause otherwise rational, caring people to make less logical and even less moral decisions. It can lead friends to flee from you in both the real world and in the social media world. However, it manifests itself when the inner voice runs amok and chatter takes the mental microphone. Our mind not only torments, but also paralyzes us. It can also lead us to do things that sabotage us. One of the most chilling discoveries that the author has had in his career is that chatter doesn't simply hurt people in an emotional sense. It also has physical implications for our body as well, from the way we experience physical pain all the way down to the way our genes operate in our cells. So this was really interesting to me. Yes, we can create a chronic psychological stress reaction just by thinking. And when our inner voice fuels that stress, it can be devastating to our own health. So the idea here is essentially creating additional pressure or just additional stress through self-talk and bad self-talk and chatter. That stress can trigger gene expression. So there's some latent things where certain genes are not expressed in your latent biology, and stress can be a trigger of some of those types of things. Some of those things can be bad. Sometimes stress triggers positive things, but not quite as often in this use case. Repetitive negative thinking is synonymous with these conditions, but it's a common feature of them. Indeed, scientists consider it a transdiagnostic risk factor for many disorders, meaning that chatter underlies a variety of mental illnesses. But here's what's most frightening about the ways in which chatter feeds stress. When our panic response is prolonged, the gradual physiological erosion it causes can harm more than our ability to fight sickness and keep our body running smoothly. It can change the way our DNA influences our health. And that's what I was just talking about. I kind of ran over myself. But stress can cause expression or inflammation of genes that are supposed to help us in the short term. These can harm us in the long run. Again, so a stress response is good. It is normal. It helps us to perform at better levels in the very short term. A stress response over the long term is very bad. So if we think about this in sports, it's actually a good thing. And I'll get into this in a little bit, but we want to be stressed. Stress brings out more alertness. Stress brings out high performance, more force out of our muscles, all of these things. But if we're always in that stress state, and our brain is one of those things that would put us in that stress state, it can be very bad for our overall health. So let's focus on the good here. I'm not going to focus too much on it because you've seen in the case studies of Tiger and Kobe, largely the benefits of positive self-talk, viewing things as challenges, but there's some other benefits as well. Another crucial way the inner voice helps us control ourselves is by evaluating us as we strive towards our goals. This frequently happens with a verbal thought popping in our mind, such like an appointment reminder appearing on our lock screen. In fact, spontaneous thoughts related to our goals are among some of the most frequent kinds that fill our mind. It's our inner voice alerting us to pay attention to an objective. Part of reaching goals involves making the right choice when there is a proverbial fork in the road, which is why our inner voice also allows us to run mental simulations. For example, when we're engaged in creative brainstorming about, say, the best way to do a presentation or the best melodic progression for a song we're writing, we internally explore different paths. So the self-talk, not only is it good to motivate us, it's also one of the main things that helps us focus and organize around goals. And we've clearly talked in the past around every athlete how important goals are. So what are we here for? So the key to beating chatter isn't to stop talking to yourself. The key is to figure out how to do so more effectively. So we're not going to completely clear our minds. We're not going to stop having these conversations with ourselves that are inherently beneficial based on how we've evolved. The goal is to have better conversations, to talk to ourselves and use strategies that allow us to direct the voice in our mind towards positive things rather than to let it spiral out of control. I think that there's a really good story that I want to start with about how this could go out of control. And then there's a happy ending to it, and we'll figure out how to reconcile a lot of these things with the strategies that we're going to go into. So the story is about a baseball player named Rick Ankiel. So he's a highly touted pitcher, a prospect, and essentially in a playoff game, he completely lost it. He threw 3 wild pitches in a row, and he essentially never pitched another game in the MLB because he could not get out of his own head. As his catcher retrieved the ball again and the seconds passed beneath the afternoon sun, he felt his mind slipping out of control into the hands of what he would come to call the monster, his cruel inner critic, a stream of verbal thoughts so vicious that they could undo years of hard work. Its voice louder than 52,000 fans in the stands. This might sound familiar. I mean, we talked with Todd Herman about the alter ego. Part of that is the villain, and clearly the monster is the villain in his case. But in this case, the villain, this monster that he's created, this representation of the negative spiral, one over his mind, one over his body, one over his performance overall. And this is essentially a horror story of what could happen if things go bad. So most of the case studies are really the opposite. So what I've been studying is how athletes, how teams, how people can use these things in a positive way, but there's 100% a way that they can be used in a negative way. And again, the goal is not to, of this is, I think everyone knows that your mind can run away. But what's even more empowering is that you can rein your mind in with a lot of these strategies. And again, this Rick Ankiel story, it does have a happy ending. I'm going to save that till the end a little bit later. So in this circumstance, let's dive into what's happening a little bit more. When we find ourselves overwhelmed by emotion, as Ankiel did on the fall day in 2000, one of the things our inner voice does is it harnesses our attention, narrowing it in on the obstacles we encounter to the exclusion of practically everything else. This serves us well most of the time, but not when it comes to exercising our attention, wrangling an automatic learned skill such as pitching was for Ankiel. So we think about that. If you want to execute to the best of your ability, you shouldn't be thinking about the physical movements you're doing. A basketball player, when they're hitting the game-winning shot, they should not be thinking about their mechanics. You should be thinking largely at see hoop, shoot ball, if I really had to dumb it down. Ankiel's verbal stream turned into a spotlight that shined his attention too brightly on the individual physical components of his pitching motion, thereby seeming to inadvertently dismantle it. His focus on mechanics was the wrong focus for his attention. When we focus on our mechanics of things that should be automatic, we get bad outcomes. As athletes, almost every action you take should be automatic. That's why we practice so hard. That's why we work so hard in these things. And chatter, our inner voice, our inner critic, is something that takes us out of that automatic state. When you're completing your taxes, it pays to double check your calculations to make sure you've done everything right, even if you're an experienced accountant. But for well-worn automatic behaviors that you're trying to execute under pressure, like pitching, the very same tendency leads us to break down the complicated scripts that we've learned to execute without thinking. This is exactly what our inner voice's tendency to immerse us in the problem does. It overfocuses our attention on the parts of the behavior that only functions as a sum of its parts. The result, paralysis by analysis. So essentially, you're getting overwhelmed by all of the little things you have to do. If you're swinging a golf club, if you're shooting a basketball, if you're swinging a baseball bat, if you're thinking about every single thing your body has to do in order to hit a golf ball or do any physical movement in sports, you're probably going to be in trouble because the golf swing, the baseball swing, shooting a basketball is inherently pretty complex. There's a lot of moving parts. It's probably, 50 plus muscles that move in every one of those things, maybe hundreds of muscles that move in every one of those things. That's inherently bad to be overthinking. So we can see where this goes wrong. We can see why this goes wrong. What are some of the basics of getting out of these negative feedback loops? So in the simplest sense, chatter is what happens when we zoom in close on something, inflaming our emotions to the exclusion of all the alternative ways of thinking about the issue that might cool us down. In other words, we lose perspective. This dramatically narrowed view of one situation magnifies adversity and allows the negative side of our inner voice to play, enabling rumination and its companions, stress, anxiety, and depression. So the closer we get to something, the more immersed we are in something, the worse it gets, the worse everything feels. The best way to avoid all of these negative things is to get distance, is to get perspective, is to zoom out. So when we're in the heat of one of these negative feedback loops, I know the feeling. You get hot, you start thinking about what everyone is thinking about you. You start thinking about how bad your situation is. You start thinking about how you're the only person in the world that this is happening to, and it's terrible. And the best way to mitigate this is to be able to zoom out and to get distance. And so let's talk about this first approach, which is distraction. So how do you get out of a situation where you're under the magnifying glass and you're feeling all this pressure at once? We're going to go through a bunch of different strategies associated with distance in this first section. So the first approach to create distance is distraction. Several studies have shown that when people find themselves sucked into a negative verbal thinking, diverting their attention away from their problems improved the way they felt. The downside of this approach, however, is that distraction constitutes a short-term fix, a band-aid that obscures the wound without healing it. So there are a lot of athletes that use, for example, mnemonics when you're playing golf or when you're doing an action that is static to make it a little bit more dynamic. So when I was playing golf, one of the coaches I worked with, we would say a refrain over and over again while I was hitting. That would occupy my conscious mind so that my unconscious could take over and hit the ball. And that worked for me for a while, but just like this says, it stopped working pretty quickly because it was only a band-aid for the thoughts I was having. Once you get used to saying the mnemonic, it doesn't quite work as well over time, or at least it didn't for me. The other approach, or another approach that they recommend, is called the fly on the wall. So how do you do this? To do so, we asked one group so this is the author, they asked one group to replay an upsetting memory in their minds through their own eyes, and then they asked another group to do the same, only from a fly on the wall perspective, visually observing themselves like a bystander. Then they asked the participants to work through their feelings from the perspective that they had been asked to adopt. The difference in the verbal stream characterizing the two groups were striking. The immersers, the people who viewed the event from the first-person perspective, got trapped in their emotions and the verbal flood they released. The fly-on-the-wall group, meanwhile, offered contrasting narratives where the immersers got tangled in the emotional weeds. The distancers went broad, which led them to feel better. I was able to see the argument more clearly, wrote one person. So by just looking at things from the perspective of a third party or someone watching what's going on from the outside looking in, you don't feel as close or like all the eyes are on you or all the pressure that you do in some of those other scenarios. Soon after, in more studies, the researchers and others discovered that zooming out in this way also reined in people's fight or flight cardiovascular response to stress. It dampened emotional activity in the brain and led people to experience less hostility and aggression when they were provoked. The kind of situation that is fertile ground for stoking chatter. So you're doing a lot of things in there. So we're looking at reducing fight or flight, we're reducing the cardiovascular response, reducing emotional activity in the brain. These are all things that you want in athletics. So this could be an effective tool or strategy if you're in some of these situations. They found that distancing by adopting an observer perspective shortened the duration of people's negative moods after they experienced events that led them to feel angry or sad. Distancing could put out chatter brush fires before they grew into larger, long-lasting conflagrations. This dampening quality of distancing could, however, have an unintended consequence. Distancing shortened both negative and positive experiences. In other words, if you got a promotion at work and stepped back to remind yourself that status and money don't really matter in the grand scheme of things, and that we all die in the end anyway, your well-deserved joy would decrease. The takeaway, if you want to hold on to positive experiences, the last thing you want to do is become a fly on the wall. In such cases, you want to immerse away. So it's really cool how we can use the contra of this to amplify the really good things that happen. And I think a lot of the best athletes do a really good job when they're remembering the good experiences or the good shots or the good performance to really zone in on them and to look at the bad experiences objectively and from a third party perspective so they can learn from them and they're not as wrapped up in the emotions that you're feeling. Researchers at Stanford, for example, linked adopting the perspective of a detached observer with less rumination over time. Across the Atlantic, researchers at Cambridge found that teaching people to see the big picture reduced intrusive thinking, so the kind that drains executive functions, and avoidance of painful memories. Other experiments demonstrated that even shrinking the size of an image that causes distress in one's imagination reduces how upset people become when they view it. And this also, looking at from a third party, increases performance in negotiation and a bunch of other things. And so students that focused on big picture reasons for doing schoolwork had higher GPAs. I thought this was really interesting. They mentioned imagination in here. Our creativity, our imagination, our ability to visualize, the flexibility within that is something that we can use to dramatically alter how much chatter affects us. So the next thing that they describe as a strategy is taking a third-party view. So rather than looking at as being a fly on the wall, a third-party view is if you were pretending to give advice to yourself. So let's say I'm in a bad situation, things aren't going well with my girlfriend. You would flip it to say, okay, Ken, if you were giving someone else advice on this same situation, what would you say to them? And then taking that advice. In one large-scale experiment, a group of scientists gave people a choice: do nothing and have a 10% chance of dying from cancer, or undergo a novel treatment that has a 5% chance of killing you. Obviously, the second option is better because the risk of death is 5% less. And yet, consistent with prior research indicating that people often choose to do nothing rather than something when it comes to their health, 40% of participants chose the more life-threatening option. But, and this is a big but, when the same people were asked to make this decision for someone else, only 31% made the bad choice. So, what would you recommend for someone else to do if they were in the same situation as you are? This can, again, dramatically improve the quality of decisions that are being made. And it's a little bit of a fun thought exercise to go outside of yourself. It can help build some empathy and things along those lines. The next thing that you can do is to create time distance. I really like this. As you can tell, a lot of the athletes that we've studied also have used this in quite a few different ways. And I'll touch on that a little bit in a second. So if you're in a bad scenario, you can think about how you'll feel about something happening 10 years from now. So let's say I get really sick, I feel miserable all day, but it's something I know I'll recover from. I can look 10 years into the future and I'll say, how would I feel about that right now? Or maybe I have a really bad round of golf, it's just a really bad practice day, I shoot a really high number. In the scheme of things, 10 years from now, I really won't care about this day. I might not even remember this day. And that's a great way to create some distance. Several studies back up scientifically what Tracy experienced personally. So Tracy was a character in the story. Again, read the book if you want to hear about her story. Quite interesting. Revealing that the ability to strategically time travel in one's mind can be a tool for creating positive personal narratives that reroute negative inner dialogues. But the benefits of mental time travel aren't restricted to adopting a bird's eye view of the past to weave together a positive story about the present. You can also benefit by mentally time traveling into the future, a tool called temporal distancing. Studies show that when people are going through a difficult experience, asking them to imagine how they'll feel about it 10 years from now rather than tomorrow can be another remarkably effective way to putting their experience in perspective. Doing so leads people to understand their experiences are temporary, which provides them hope. So I love this quote from Kobe Bryant, and I think it embodies it really effectively. I asked a ton of questions. I was curious. I wanted to improve, to learn, to fill my head with the history of the game. No matter who I was with, a coach, a Hall of Famer, a teammate, and no matter the situation, game, practice, vacation, I would fire away with question after question. A lot of people appreciated my curiosity and passion. My approach always was that I'd rather risk embarrassment now than be embarrassed later when I'd won 0 titles. So he's using how he would feel in the future when he would become an NBA champion, or how he would feel bad in the future if he didn't ask these questions now as a mechanism to get something done. I think that that's a very unique way that Kobe was able to illustrate a very similar concept to empower him to ask a lot of questions, empower him to be as good as he could be in the present. The last strategy in this first section is related to journaling. So the psychologist James Pennebaker has shown that simply asking people to write about their most upsetting negative experiences for 15 to 20 minutes to create a narrative around what happened, if you will, leads them to feel better, visit a doctor less, and have healthier immune function. By focusing on our experiences from the perspective of a narrator who has to create a story, journaling creates distance from our experience. We feel less tied to it. Tracy journaled for years, and it helped her immensely. Serena is someone who credits a lot of her success to journaling as well. And it's interesting to think about journaling in the scope of the Kobe story. So Kobe routinely wrote, and we talked about in his episode how much he viewed himself as a hero in his own journey. So if we're creating a narrative, heroes always have adversity. They always face adversity, but they always overcome it. If you're writing these things down, if you're taking that frame that this is just part of the story that you're writing and you are the hero, you're almost always going to come out of it in the end in a positive way or in a greater way, or you're going to learn a lesson and you're going to be better off because of it. So these are all strategies to help distance. Something that is a bit of a struggle with these strategies is they don't really work that well in the moment. A lot of them take mental energy, they take time, they take a notebook in order to journal. And if you're going through something, let's say a sporting event, or you're in the moment, you have to make 2 free throws to win the game. These are not things that necessarily might work that well. Like, yes, maybe you can look at it from a third-party perspective, but there isn't necessarily one that takes energy, but 2, it takes time. So these are a couple different strategies that are focused on what's happening in the present and what you can do. So the first is distant self-talk. So this is the author talking about his research. Our idea was that using your own name while also employing the second and third person created emotional distance because it makes you feel as if you were talking to another person when you're talking to yourself. For example, rather than thinking to oneself, why did I blow up at my coworker today? A person could think, why did Ken blow up at his coworker today? I think that that's an interesting one. As we practiced, participants who used distant self-talk reported that they experienced less shame and embarrassment after giving their speech compared to participants who used immersed self-talk. They also ruminated less about the performance afterwards in their descriptions of their mental experiences. Instead of highlighting their nervousness or the difficulty of the task, they said their inner voices focused on the fact that nothing of real consequence was actually at stake. So these people in the study, they had to talk in front of a group with very little notice, and they had to talk for 5 minutes. So it's a very stressful situation for most people. If you're a lunatic like me, you might enjoy it, but this was a great way for them to create a rough scenario for these people and to test out if this type of self-talk worked. It also improved performance, which I think is interesting. So judges who watched videos of the participant speeches indicated that people in the distant self-talk group performed better on the task as well. They had uncovered a novel distancing tool hidden in the mind. It's distant self-talk. So as their experiments and others later demonstrated, shifting from the first person I to the second person you or the third person he or she provides a mechanism for gaining emotional distance. Here's just a quick glimpse into how Tiger talked to himself. This was in the 1997 Masters, when after the front 9, he really didn't play very well. He said to himself, let's get back to even par. Let's start with this swing here, the same one that you've been making all week in practice. This is what he's saying to himself. You also hear Tiger talking to himself on the range, or if it's a bad shot, he goes, Tiger, or some of those types of things. Very common for athletes, especially ones that we've studied, to do that. The next thing we can do should sound pretty familiar by now, but it's viewing things as a challenge. So if you listen to the Kobe series, you should be tired of me telling you about this, but it's a real thing. It's science. It's very valuable. From taking math exams to performing in pressure-filled situations to coping with the toxic effects of stereotyping, people think, feel, and perform better when they frame the stressor at hand as a challenge rather than a threat. But as Mr. Rogers' use of his own name to motivate himself suggests, distant self-talk can be the pivotal shove that sends you down the path of the challenge mindset. Research shows that distant self-talk leads people to consider a stressful situation more in challenge-oriented terms, allowing them to provide encouraging, you can do it advice to themselves, rather than catastrophizing the situation. So this way of talking to yourself can help to encourage you to make the shift towards viewing something as a threat rather than a challenge. That to me is very profound. Just changing the way we talk to ourselves, changing basically me, instead of saying I, saying, Ken, you can do better than this. Ken, why did you do it that way? Let's improve next time. That's a way to make that very quick mental shift. A lot of things take a lot of time. This to me is something that takes a very little amount of time to make a very profound change. When a person is in a threat state, their vasculature constricts, leaving less room for their blood to flow, which over time can lead to a burst blood vessel and heart attacks. In contrast, when people are in a challenge mode, their vasculature relaxes, allowing blood to move easily throughout the body. Put more simply, through distant self-talk, could you persuade not only your mind, but your body to see a situation as challenging rather than threatening? Sure enough, participants who were asked to use their name to reflect on stress before giving public speech displayed a challenge mode cardiovascular response. People in the immersed language group displayed a textbook biological threat response. How crazy is that? Just talking to ourselves differently can change our physiology. I love that. And the way it changes our physiology is something that's positive for our health and our overall performance. This doesn't mean you always have to be talking about yourself or to yourself in the third person, But it does mean that when you're in these high pressure situations, changing the terminology you use with yourself, it doesn't even have to be out loud. It can just be internal, it can be a really beneficial thing. And let's use a couple examples from our athletes. So when you talk about Kobe and Tiger both getting over injuries, this is something that they do incredibly well. They frame these things as challenges. So Kobe says, before the Achilles injury, I was thinking about my career arc. I could feel my body wearing out, and I knew I was on the clock. When the Achilles injury happened, I treated it as a new challenge. People were saying I might not be able to come back, but I knew I was not going to let it beat me. I wasn't going to let an injury dictate my retirement. I was going to dictate my own retirement. That's when I decided to climb that mountain. So obviously we're not talking specifically about the distant self-talk, but it is very clear that he is viewing this recovery as a challenge in and of itself. The next thing I want to talk about is alter ego. So we've interviewed Todd Herman. We've talked a lot about alter ego, but this book also brings it up. And it brings it up in the form of the Batman effect. So I'm not going to touch too much on this. We know how this works, but an alter ego is a way to distance yourself from adversity, to disassociate with things that you don't like, but associate yourself now with things that are empowering for you. With this question in mind, the psychologists Stephanie Carlson and Rachel White discovered what is known as the Batman effect. In one experiment, they had a group of children pretend that they were a superhero as they performed a boring task designed to simulate the experience of having to complete a tedious homework assignment. The kids were asked to assume the role of the character and then ask themselves how they were performing on a task using the character's name. For example, a girl in the study who was pretending to be Dora the Explorer was instructed to ask herself, is Dora working hard during the study? Carlson and White found that the kids who did this persevered longer than the children who reflected on their experience in the normal way using I. Kids in the third group who used their own names also outperformed the I group. It's pretty interesting. I guess alter ego is also related to how we refer to ourselves. Even if we're referring to ourselves in the third person, that's kind of creating an alter ego of ourselves. I mean, like Shaquille O'Neal, Shaq, right? There's a lot of these people who or David Goggins, they're using their own name as their alter ego. The last quick strategy that people can use to disassociate is related to using the global you. So what is the global you? It means it's referring to you as in everyone. So if an athlete says, well, when you're out there and you're not playing your best, you sometimes just have to put your head down and work, right? He is not talking about I. If he was doing that, he would say I. He's generalizing a situation or his or her situation to the broader global population. And this can be an effective way to disperse some of the pressure that you feel. There's a potent psychological comfort that comes from normalizing experiences, from knowing that what you're experiencing isn't unique to you, but rather something everyone experiences. That unpleasantness, as it is just the stuff of life. When we're going through grief, relationship turbulence, professional setbacks, parenting struggles, or other types of adversity, we often feel agonizingly alone, zoomed in as we are on our problems. Yet when we talk with others and learn that they have faced similar challenges, we realize that as hard as the experience is, it happens to other people, which gives us an immediate sense of perspective. Indeed, once you notice this phenomenon, it's hard to read interviews with athletes talking about bad games or politicians doing interviews about obstacles without noticing their use of you in the fashion to frame their experience more broadly. This is a very common thing. I encourage you, next time you listen to an interview with an athlete, post-game, whatever it might be, listen for this. And the last part, so participants were almost 5 times more likely to use the universal you when they were trying to learn from their negative experience than when they simply rehashed what happened. It connected their personal adversity more generally to how the world works. Participants who were asked to learn from their experience wrote statements like, when you take a step back and cool off, sometimes you see things from a different perspective, and you can actually learn a lot from others who see things differently than you. So if you're thinking about a bad experience you had, when you're viewing something in these terms, using a language of you and the global you can help you to turn these into lessons rather than failures. Okay, so what other things can you use to mitigate chatter? So it's not just the way we talk to ourselves. There are actually other forces at play that can help us to improve and reduce the amount of negative chatter that we have. The first one I thought was pretty interesting was just nature. So there was a pretty famous study in Chicago where there's a public housing project, and some of the rooms had access to beautiful greenery and some other ones had access to like a parking lot or to a normal cityscape. And this is what they found. When Ming and her team analyzed the data, they found that tenants who lived in apartments with green views were significantly better at focusing their attention than those whose buildings looked out at barren cityscapes. They also procrastinated less when making challenging decisions and felt that their obstacles that they faced were less debilitating. In other words, their behavior was more positive, their thinking was calmer, and more challenge-oriented. So just changing your environment can really have a profound impact on how you approach or how your brain processes chatter. Meanwhile, a 2015 high-resolution satellite imagery study of the Canadian city of Toronto found that having just 10 more trees on a city block was associated with improvements in people's health comparable to an increase in their annual income of $10,000 or being 7 years younger. That's pretty wild if you think about it. A lot of us, I mean, at least I didn't until fairly recently, I didn't think about having a ton of greenery, a ton of nature, a ton of these things around me. And I have found that it has an incredible recuperating effect. In athletes who are at the top of their games, at the highest level of things, any little thing, anything that can help you process better, anything that can help you relax better, probably is beneficial. So it might be worth going for a walk in the park or something along those lines if you can. The finding, participants' performance on the attention test improved considerably after the nature walk, but not the urban walk. Their ability to invert strings of numbers and repeat them back to the experimenter was much sharper. Moreover, the result didn't depend on whether participants took their walks in the idyllic summer or the gloomy winter. No matter what time of year, a nature stroll helped their attention more than an urban one did. Also, it's not just nature. Outside natural sounds helped as well. So if you're thinking about how to get in the zone before a game, how to maximize your performance, it could just be to go for a walk outside and to detach a little bit. Another thing related to nature, and this is a phenomenon you find quite frequently in nature, is awe. So people that were able to reach a state of awe also had dramatically less chatter. The neural activity associated with self-immersion decreases, similar to how the brain responds when people meditate or take psychedelics like LSD, which are notorious for blurring the line between a person's sense of self and the surrounding world. And this is, again, awe that they're describing. When you're in the presence of something vast and indescribable, it's hard to maintain the view that you and the voice in your head are the center of the world. This changes the synaptic flow of your thoughts in similar ways as other distancing techniques that we've examined. In the case of awe, however, you don't have to focus your mind on a visual exercise or on reframing an upsetting experience. In this sense, it's similar to saying your own name. You just have to have the experience wherever it happens to be, and the relief follows. When you feel smaller in the midst of awe-inspiring insights, it's a phenomenon described as shrinking of self, and so do your problems. To get into the next way that we can reduce chatter, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story. I thought this was pretty interesting. In June 2018, the Spanish tennis superstar Rafa Nadal stepped onto the clay courts of the French Open to battle in the tournament's final match in pursuit of his 11th championship there. That summer day in Paris, with 15,000 fans waiting restlessly to watch a world-class match, he and his opponent, the Austrian Dominic Thiem, came out of the locker rooms, ready to compete. Nadal did what he always does before a match. First, he walked across the court to his bench with a single racket in his hand. Then he took off his warm-up jacket as he faced the crowd, bouncing back and forth vigorously on the balls of his feet. And as usual, he placed his tournament ID card on his bench facing up. Then the match began. Nadal jumped ahead right away, winning the first set. After each point, he fiddled with his hair and shirt before the next serve, as if arranging them back in place. During breaks in the action, he sipped a power drink and water and then returned both exactly as they had been, in front of his chair to his left, one precisely behind the other, aligned at a diagonal with the court. 2 sets later, Nadal beat Thiem and left the French Open victorious yet again. Although you might think that competing against world-class athletes and making sure you don't pull a muscle are the most essential parts of professional tennis, it's not true for Nadal, one of the greatest players in history. What I battle hardest to do in a tennis match, he says, is to quiet the voices in my head. And his quirky customs on the court, which many of his fans find amusing but strange, provide him with a perfectly reasonable method of doing so. By always placing his ID face up, carefully arranging his water bottles so they're perfectly aligned in front of his bench, and making sure that his hair is just right before a serve, Nadal is engaging in a process called compensatory control. He's creating order in his physical environment to provide him with the order he seeks internally. As he puts it, it's a way of placing myself in a match, ordering my surroundings to match the order I seek in my head. I thought this was really interesting. I do this with my work. If my desk is really messy, I cannot work effectively. If things are out of place or I feel they're out of place, I feel like I don't have a lot of control and I can't divert my full attention to things. Nadal takes this to the extreme, but it's really interesting to see how this impacts a great athlete and how maybe you could order this as well. It is one thing to have those things in order and then the order be shaken up. Maybe his bench is in a different place. Maybe there's other things. So if you're creating order, it might be good to focus on things that explicitly you can control. I know with Michael Phelps, for example, his coach broke his goggles one race. He would do all these things so that Michael Phelps wouldn't necessarily need a strict order, strict routine, but he could do a lot of the order creating in his head or with his routine or some of these other things. This tendency to structure elements in our environment as a buffer against chatter goes beyond context in which our performance is being evaluated. It extends to any spaces that we occupy. So what scientists have discovered, however, is that just like Nadal, we can stimulate our sense of order in the world, by extension our own minds, by organizing our surroundings and making sure that our physical environments conform to a particular controllable structure. I think this is really interesting if we frame this in terms of Tiger and of Kobe. So they both were rigorous about organizing their practice. So it wasn't necessarily that they would do the same thing every day, but they had to carve out these times, they had to go specifically, and there were no compromises with where and when they would practice, but there were with how they would practice. And I think that their control over their practice and their control over their time and their work and their effort was very important to them. And that's one of the things that helped them to succeed. The last section related to this that I want to touch on is also related to ritual and placebo. So Nadal did have these rituals that he would do, or these habits that he would do, or these maybe routines that he would do before matches. But there's a step further that we can take it. So for example, Michael Jordan, he wore his collared shorts beneath his Bulls uniform in every game that he played. Study after study demonstrates that simply believing that a placebo, a charmed object, healing human presence like a shaman or trusted physician, or a special environment is going to make us feel better actually does. For example, fewer stomach cramps for irritable bowel syndrome patients, less frequent headache attacks for migraine sufferers, and improved respiratory symptoms for asthmatics. Though the amount of relief that the placebo provides varies notably across diseases and patients. Like Mesmer's patients, it's like Mesmer, the famous, hypnotist, some people are more naturally sensitive to placebos than others. In some cases, it can be substantial. So when we look, for example, at Tiger Woods, I wouldn't necessarily say hypnosis or some of these things were placebos, but his confidence in their effectiveness definitely worked. There's also an element of Tiger and Kobe, how hard they worked. They believed that there was an additional layer that they could go into, and part of their hard work could be perceived as a little bit of a placebo effect. Like they believed that their hard work paid off, so it did really pay off. The interesting thing, though, is that if people even know about the placebo effect, it can still be effective. So in effect, we told them, if you think a substance will help you, it will. So it's a little bit complicated, but if I gave you a placebo and you knew it was a placebo, but I told you that you knowing that a placebo would work would still help it work, it still works. And it does. And that's the crazy thing, is that even if a ritual isn't substantiated, just because you believe in it and you believe that placebos can be substantiated, it still does work in the long run. So essentially what I'm saying is, if you believe something could possibly work, it does work, and to continue doing nothing. So it's interesting. They talk about rituals versus routine. What are the differences between these things? Rituals are inherently more valuable for eliminating chatter. It's important to point out that rituals aren't simply habits or routines. Several features distinguish them from the more prosaic customs that fill our lives. First, they tend to consist of rigid sequences of behaviors or performed in the same order. That's different from habit or routine, in which case the sequence of steps composing those behaviors can be looser or can frequently change. The reason rituals are so effective at helping us manage our inner voices is that they're a chatter-reducing cocktail that influences us through several avenues. For one, they direct our attention away from what's bothering us. The demands they place on our working memory to carry out the tasks of the ritual leave little room for anxiety and negative manifestations of the inner voice. This might explain why pregame rituals abound in sports, providing a distraction at the most anxiety-filled moment. Many rituals also provide us with a sense of order because we perform behaviors we can control. You think of LeBron throwing up the chalk before the games, things along those lines. Because rituals are infused with meaning and often connect the purpose or powers that transcend our individual concerns, they also make us feel connected to important values and communities which fulfill our emotional needs and serve as a hedge against isolation. This symbolic feature of rituals also often furnishes us with awe, which broadens our perspective in ways that minimize how preoccupied we are with our concern. Of course, rituals also frequently activate the placebo mechanism. If we believe they will aid us, then they do. And it's cool to think about this in the frame of the alter ego effect. One of the big parts about that is having a totem, having a ritual that you do to become your alter ego. I think that this is completely aligned with how that works. There's a couple other quick tools that I want to mention that were at the end in sort of the how-to guide part of the book, which I really liked. If you're going to get the book, it's almost worth it just to have that. It goes through all of these and more, some more unorthodox things as well. The first is that we can reinterpret chatter, the physical response, as a positive thing. We've talked about this a lot of times in the past, but we have this physical phenomenon of nervousness and anxiousness. It's essentially identical to excitement. So if we're reframing this nervousness as excitement, it can be very effective. Another thing they recommended is to limit social media usage. So social media can be one big pity party. It can also be a source of a lot of chatter, especially now for athletes. Young professional athletes in particular are really struggling with how much negative things they see on social media. And it can be a great thing just to ignore all that, turn it off, don't have it. Even though NIL and some of these types of things are coming out and it could be a source of money, you're probably going to have better returns on your time invested by spending it practicing ignoring social media than really investing in doing a lot of social media. This last section that I want to touch on is related to how we can help our teammates or their players, or if you're a coach and you're trying to figure out how to help people you work with chatter, this is something I think is really interesting and important. I see this a lot more with a lot of the people that I talk to, how to navigate when someone is struggling with something mentally, they're going through a slump, any of these types of things is a very valuable skill to have. It's a little sad, but they use tragedies to figure out and break down what's an effective way to communicate with people that are suffering or going through these downward spirals. So while the students at Virginia Tech and Northern Illinois University thought that expressing their emotions to others made them feel better, the degree to which they shared their emotions didn't actually influence their depression and post-traumatic stress symptoms. All that emoting, writing, connecting, and remembering, it hadn't been beneficial. So these were after the very notable school shootings. What they're finding here is that just sharing and remembering and talking about the experience didn't help to reconcile how they were feeling. It actually made them feel worse. Just talking and doing these things without an aim, without a reconciliation, wasn't good for them. That doesn't mean you shouldn't talk about your feelings, but it means that if you're going to talk about a negative experience, you have to frame it in a certain way for it to be effective. And they looked at this in the frame of 9/11 as well. The people who shared their thoughts and feelings about 9/11 right after it happened didn't feel better. In fact, on the whole, they fared worse than the people in the study who didn't open up about how they felt. They experienced more chatter and engaged in more avoidant coping. Moreover, among those who did choose to express their feelings, the people who shared the most had the highest levels of general distress and the worst physical health. Once again, sharing emotions didn't help. In this case, it hurt. So if someone just wants to talk to you and vent and say how bad things are, that's actually not beneficial to them. And we're going to go into some strategies about how to have proper conversations with them that lead them to resolving their chatter rather than perpetuating it. In study after study, Rime found that talking to others about our negative experiences doesn't help us recover in any meaningful way. Sure, sharing our emotions with others makes us feel closer to and more supported by people that we open up to, but the ways most of us commonly talk and listen to each other do little to reduce our chatter. Quite frequently, they exacerbate it. Rime's finding, along with many others, clashes dramatically with conventional wisdom. Talking, we're often told by pop culture, makes you feel better. Much self-help literature tells us this, as do many people around us. We hear that venting our emotions is healthy and supporting others is indispensable. It's not that simple, though there are reasons where it might be. Again, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about negative experiences. We just need to approach them with a different perspective. When we're dealing with chatter, we confront a riddle that demands solving. Inhibited by our inner voice run amok, we at times need outside help to work through the problem at hand, see the bigger picture, and decide on the most constructive course of action. All this can't be addressed solely by a caring presence and a listening ear of a supportive person. We often need others to help us distance, normalize, and change the way we're thinking about experiences we're going through. By doing so, we allow our emotions to cool down, pulling us out of dead-end rumination and aiding us in redirecting our verbal stream. Yet this is why talking about emotions so often backfires, in spite of its enormous potential to help. When our minds are bathed in chatter, we display a strong bias towards satisfying our emotional needs over our cognitive ones. In other words, when we're upset, we tend to over-focus on receiving empathy rather than finding practical solutions. This is really interesting. So what they're describing is, in order to get through these scenarios, you have to use some of these psychological distancing techniques. But in the urge to feel comforted, we don't do those things. We feel and we seek companionship. We seek bonding with people, but that's actually not what is best for us. And when we're helping other people, often our urge is to comfort them, when in effect we should be trying to help them think more logically and distance from the scenario. So when we focus on negative aspects of our experience, that tends to activate a related negative thought, which activates another negative thought, and another, and so on. These dominoes continue to hit one another in a game where there's potentially infinite supply of tiles. This is because our memories of emotional experiences are governed by principles of associationism, which means that related concepts are linked together in our mind. So bad things are linked to other bad things, which are linked to other bad things that can create this downward spiral. As someone helping, your goal is to disassociate and break this chain. You don't want to be rough. You don't want to be callous with these people, but guiding them towards distance and using some of the strategies we talk about here can be an effective way to help. It's also important for us as athletes to find people that we believe can help us when we're dealing with these things. You're going to find people that you talk to. Some will be really helpful. Some will help you tell you how it is. Some will help you distance from things, and some might not be good for that. They might want to go into it with you, and that's generally not something that you want. As an athlete, it's important to find a group where you can share what helps you in the correct ways. Some people are better at this than others. Another way, if you're a coach or you're someone that is dealing with someone in a slump or dealing with chatter, sometimes just direct confrontation, talking about things is not the best thing to do. Some people just don't take it that well, even if you're using the distancing techniques. This is another very effective way to help out. The study revealed that helping without the recipient being aware of it, it's a phenomenon called invisible support, was the formula for supporting others while not making them feel bad about lacking the resources to cope on their own. As a result of receiving indirect assistance, the participants felt less depressed. In practice, this could be any form of surreptitious practical support, like taking care of housework without being asked or creating a more quiet space for the person to work. If you're thinking about in the team environment, picking things up or grabbing an extra Gatorade or water or whatever it is for your teammates, there's these little things that can help move mountains for people and get them through things. When going through and editing the episode, I realized that I never followed up about Rick Ankiel. So he did not end up ever pitching in the major leagues again. But he did come back as an outfielder and had I believe, 7-year career as an incredible hitter and also as someone who had an incredible arm, one of the best arms of all time from the outfield. To me, this is an impressive and incredible thing that he could go from this failure on the baseball field to now becoming someone who has a potential angle at the Hall of Fame or something along those lines. His story is incredible because he was able to overcome this. Granted, he couldn't overcome the intimidation that he felt on the mound, but he was able to come out and play baseball again at a really high level, even in a slightly different domain. During that period where he took off, he worked on himself a tremendous amount. He started working specifically on goal setting, how he talked to himself around these goals, visualizing, as well as setting these process goals rather than outcome goals. To me, this is a testament to how the mechanisms we use to talk with ourselves, to motivate ourselves, to get ourselves in the proper mindset for success can really help improve the outcomes that we have. And it can even turn around a career like it did with Rick. Those are all the details from Chatter. Again, I highly recommend you check this book out. It is linked in the show notes and the description. As always, thank you for tuning in to the Exponential Athlete podcast. These take a lot of work on my end, and I really enjoy doing it. But it means so much that people are tuning in to check these out. It means so much that people are sharing and giving ratings online. And if you want to continue to help, please just share this episode or the podcast with a friend. That is the single best way to help encourage me to create more content like this. Again, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that this episode leads to just a little less chatter on your end. Bye now.